asked last year if I wanted to, or in the, let's see, what is it? It's springtime, yes, it was in the fall. Would you like to do a class on Broadway and religion? Well, I'll do anything having to do with Broadway. Broadway's dance with religion has been an interesting trip. I'm not going to cover everything, of course, there won't be time. I'm going to start off with some shows where, let's face it, Broadway's often making fun of all kinds of things, and religion is something that a lot of commentators have made fun of over the years. And so we find characters who are associated with religion in shows, some of them playing it straight, some of them playing it mostly as a joke. But if we're going to start off with Broadway, let's just start off with some real razzmatazz. And this is a show from 1934. It's called Anything Goes by Cole Porter. Now, before you hear anything about religion in the show, you need to understand that this is a musical comedy from the 1930s, which means the important thing was the score. The score was by Cole Porter, and it had a whole bunch of hits in it that became very famous, like the title song, Anything Goes, another song maybe called Friendship, all kinds of songs. Anyway, the book of the show was supposed to be about a shipwreck. Now, why a shipwreck was supposed to be funny, I have no idea, but it certainly wasn't funny when the Morro Castle turned over and burned off of Morro Castle, New Jersey, shortly before the show was supposed to go into rehearsal, and 100 and some people died. So they needed a new plot. So they threw away the plot, they kept all the songs, and wrote a whole new story. Now that should give you an idea how important the story really was. So the story was kind of silly, as these shows tend to be. And one of the figures in the story was Reno Sweeney, played by Ethel Merman, who at this point was 26 years old and was already a big star on Broadway. Reno Sweeney was a revival minister, an evangelist, who went around the world doing her thing, which tended to be more like Broadway shows, but supposedly had some religion related to it. She does a number on the ship called Blow Gabriel Blow, which of course is really just a song and dance number. And this is Sutton Foster right in the middle, one of the big, she was in Anything Goes several years ago. This is them doing the number on late night television. Based upon stories by Damon Runyon, who was a New York writer who wrote about the gamblers and the mission workers and others who tended to live around Times Square at the time. And one of those mission workers, the mission worker in the show, is Sarah Brown. And they never say it's the Salvation Army, it's the Save a Soul mission, but it certainly appears to be the Salvation Army in any way that you might want to look at it. And there's a situation in it where, we've got a bunch of gamblers, and what the gamblers are trying to do is figure out where they're going to have their next crack game. And the wonderful song about that is the oldest established permanent floating crack game in New York, which is they're always looking for someplace else to do it. And in the process of all of this, Sky Masterson ends up, there's a bet with Sky Masterson, who's a very wealthy and successful gambler who would be able to bankroll the money they need to find a place to have this crap game. And they've suckered him into a bet where he has to try to take Sarah Brown out to dinner. Well, actually, he has to take her to Havana to dinner. This is, of course, pre-Castro. So a lot of people in New York, when they went on vacation, they went to Havana. So he's in the mission trying to, start to the process of trying to bring her to dinner. We find out in this that Sky Masterson actually knows quite a bit about the Bible. And to execute that scene, we're going to have Marty Kessler playing Sky Masterson and Caitlin Laird playing Sarah Brown, where we're going to see more or less the idea of his knowledge of the Bible being, part of the story and also part of the joke that makes, that starts the show off. Anyway, behind them, there's a sign with a biblical passage ascribed to a particular book. You need to know that for this to make sense.
Here are two of our pamphlets I'd like you to read. They will give you a good deal of comfort.
Thank you.
And we're holding a midnight prayer meeting on Thursday, which I'm sure you will wish to attend.
Oh, I'm sure, Esther. I hope you will not think I'm getting out of line, but I think it is wonderful to see a pretty doll, a nice-looking girl like yourself, sacrificing herself for the sake of others. Staying in this here in this place. Well, do you ever go anyplace else? Travel or something?
Well, I'd like to go to Africa.
That's a bit far. There are a lot of wonderful places just a few hours from New York by plane. Oh, ever been in a plane?
No.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Here is another pamphlet I think you should read.
Well, thank you. Of course, I will need a lot of personal help from you. My heart is as black as 2 feet down a wolf's gullet.
I will be speaking at Thursday's prayer meeting.
Oh, I need private lessons. Why don't we have dinner or something?
I think not, Mr. Masterson.
Sorry, just blossoming under the warmth of your kindness. Hey, that's wrong.
What's wrong?
That's not Proverbs, that's Isaiah.
It's Proverbs.
Sorry. No peace to the wicked, Isaiah chapter 57, verse 21.
Isaiah.
There are 2 things been in every hotel room in the country. Sky Masterson and the Gideon Bible. I must have read the good book 10 or 12 times.
You've read the Bible 12 times?
What's wrong with the Bible? Besides, in my business, the strangest information frequently comes in handy. I once won 5 G's on a parlay, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
That's tough to follow.
But so the characters obviously come from the Salvation Army. I'm not saying it's a serious show about religion. Of course it isn't. We're going to be getting to some where religion isn't. But just, I want to survey references to it in some earlier shows. If we go into our Rodgers and Hammerstein, we have Carousel. And I mean, Carousel, you have this ne'er-do-well named Billy Bigelow who just gets in all kinds of trouble and ends up killing himself during a failed robbery at the end of the first act. At the end of the second act, he is at Heaven's Gate trying to get in. It's not Gabriel or someone there or St. Peter or whatever. It's a character called the Star Keeper. And the Star Keeper actually gives him a chance to go back to Earth and fix some of the mess he made during the course of his life. The entire second act is sort of, it's this reflection upon life and how persons live their life with sort of a heavenly bent going underneath it. You go on to Rodgers and Hammerstein, you run into Sound of Music. And of course, Sound of Music, let's face it, one of the main characters wants to be a nun. She's not going to be a very good nun, as we find out. She'll be a much better governess to 7 children, and ends up marrying the captain. But there's all kinds of religious references in the show because, of course, we have people in it who are commonly talking religiously. I've always loved the moment where they're trying to escape at the end and the Reverend Mother is saying, "Remember the song, lift thine eyes to the hills." So the references are there. The show Brigadoon, which is a little less well known, it's by Lerner and Lowe. It's a show where 2 Americans are going through the Scottish Highlands and they come across a village which isn't on any map. That's because it only exists 1 day per century. And it only exists 1 day per century because in 1747, because it starts in 1947, the minister made a pact with God because he was so afraid of all the witches and everyone around it was going to affect and make his town as evil as everything around it. So this pact with God is that the town will only exist 1 day per century so that the world cannot encroach on it. But boy, does it get encroached on at that moment. Anyway, so when we get to something like Fiddler on the Roof, we're dealing with a show where religion starts to play a major role. And of course that's because we have these figures in it who, their lives are based entirely on their religion. When they were writing Fiddler on the Roof. The book was by a man named Joseph Stein. The music was by Jerry Bach. Sheldon Harnick wrote the lyrics. And these people were all Jewish. And of course, as many people know, a lot of the Broadway audience, especially at that time, was Jewish. You have to remember, New York remains the most populous Jewish city in the world. And they wrote this show, which was about all the, these people who get thrown out of the Ukraine by the Russian hierarchy. The Jews who lived in this little fictional town in the shtetl, the Jewish ghetto in Anatevka. But I mean, these are people who spend their entire lives, they base everything they do on their religion. They're observant Jews who observe all of the aspects of kosher behavior, kosher food, and, everything they do has some relationship to what to their understanding of their religion. And it's not played for laughs in the show. Well, it is kind of, Tevye the milkman. These are stories, they're based on stories by a writer named Shalom Aleichem, who wrote in Yiddish. You have to remember Yiddish, this international language that Jews, basically from anywhere in Europe could read. He wrote in Yiddish, and he wrote a story called Tevye the Milkman. And Tevye had 5 daughters, and he's a poor dairyman. He's never going to be able to supply a dowry for these young women, and who knows how they're going to end up. And we have the oldest 3 of them get married during the course of the show. And while that's going on, each one breaks further from the hallowed traditions of this community. The first one, he thinks he's gone through the marriage broker and set up a marriage with an older butcher. Well, she doesn't want to marry the butcher, she wants to marry a tailor that she's fallen in love with. And Tevye allows her to do that. So that breaks a little bit with the tradition. The next one is fallen in love with a radical student who was also Jewish, Perchik, who's been living in their home teaching the women. And he allows them to get married, again, breaking with the tradition. Well, the third one, he just can't even possibly assimilate into his system of belief because she falls in love with a Russian Orthodox kid and converts and goes off and marries him. So, the show is about the breaking of traditions. And of course, these traditions are all grounded in the religion these people live. So we see, that religion gets set up for us as a backstory, showing us what's going on early in the first act, and then you observe it as it goes through. When they were writing the story, and it was getting ready to go on Broadway, there were people who were worried it wasn't universal enough. It was too Jewish. But they were partly ignoring the fact that much of their audience was Jewish. This story was about the grandparents of a number of people who were in the audience. And they also were missing how universal the story is anyway, because an awful lot of societies are based on tradition and the banging of heads that goes on between generations over those traditions. One of the people who worked heavily on the show, he was an assistant director, was in Japan for the opening of Fiddler on the Roof in Japan. And somebody who'd seen it walked up to him and said, "Is this show popular in the United States?" Well, yes, it's very popular. Why do you ask? Well, I don't understand because it's so Japanese. Well, I mean, Japan is it's a society very much based in its traditions, and those traditions change as the generations go on. And of course, Fiddler's become a very, very well-known piece of work, but a couple of numbers in it, which demonstrate how seriously that religious tradition was taken in the process of writing this show. Tevye is constantly talking to God. If you don't have a good Tevye when you're casting this, just forget it. He's on stage almost all the time. Most of the interactions going on in the show are with Tevye. And he's coming back, and it's almost time for Sabbath celebration on Friday night. And when he's coming back, he's pulling his cart and his horse because his horse threw a shoe during the course of the day and wasn't able to pull the cart anymore. So Tevye is saying, "Today I am a horse. Dear God, did you have to make my poor old horse lose his shoe just before the Sabbath? That wasn't nice." It's enough you pick on me. Tevye blessed me with 5 daughters, a life of poverty. What have you got against my horse? Sometimes I think when things are too quiet up there, you say to yourself, let's see, what kind of mischief can I play on my friend Tevye? And then, he has an interaction with Golda, who basically says, shake a leg, get ready, it's time for the Sabbath. Well, in Broadway musicals, time stops for songs all the time. So Tevye finally says, as the good book says, heal us, Lord, and we shall be healed. In other words, send us the cure. We've got the sickness already. Tevye is always giving his own interpretations of the Bible, and whether the rabbi would agree or not is really up for grabs. But this is when he sings the song, If I Were a Rich Man. So I'm going to start off, I guess a little bit of context. This is Zero Mostel, who was the original Tevye on Broadway. Those of you seeing the man.
If I were a wealthy young man,
I mean, the people that this show is about believe seriously in a God. That belief, it colors everything that they do in their lives. God is a constant presence in the Jewish interpretation of God in Fiddler on the Roof. And here he is kind of arguing with God at times during the course of the show. Well, read Job. Jews believe you can argue with God. They believe you can have disputes with God. Sometimes, especially really conservative Christians look at something like that and they find it somewhat blasphemous. It's not at all blasphemous in the Jewish tradition. And you find this in a lot of Jewish works of art. And then later in this show, not much later, because we're just now getting to the Sabbath, we have a number called Sabbath Prayer. And this is not the kind of thing one finds in a musical very often. Again, we're trying to show the importance of religion in these people's lives. This is from the film. Topol is playing Tevye, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen the film. But this is the number Sabbath Prayer, and remember, we're also finding out about the way their lives work. Where he's talking about, sit and talk with the elder, talk with the learned people 7 hours every day. That's one reason you wanted to get wealthy when you were Jewish, so you would have a chance to discuss the scriptures with people. That's why Jews for centuries had much higher literacy rates than anyone else around them, because reading the scripture was so important to them. Then he says, have a seat by the eastern wall. That's the most expensive seats in the temple, because it's closest to Jerusalem. Again, you're finding out about what their lives are like and how every little aspect of them is colored by their religious belief. So now we get together for Sabbath, and the whole family has to be there. There's just no two ways about it. The scene. Sorry, stop it before we get something else. YouTube's so great with that. Now you want to watch this, right? You listen to the song, you pay attention to the lyrics. Obviously they're written for a man and a woman who have 5 daughters. So the prayer is for what the daughters are supposed to be able to expect in that society. But like I said, there are just not a lot of shows where religion is taken so seriously and plays such a huge role in people's lives.
Was the young man there a son-in-law?
Well, there were two young men. There was this Perchik, the stranger. He just got there, actually. He's the one who ends up marrying the second daughter, Hodel. And the other guy was Model, who's the tailor that Zeidel, the first daughter, wants to marry. So you're right. Why are there men at the table? Well, there they are. And of course, the camera's showing, if you're paying attention to what's going on and what they're saying, and the stranger, yes, the stranger is someone said over here. Anyway, any other questions about Fiddler on the Roof before I go on? Okay, you get to the late 60s and early 70s, and you start getting some shows that are not, they're really completely based in religion. And some rather interesting things are going on. The shows we're going to talk about in detail from here on out are Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, Godspell, Jesus Christ Superstar, not in this order. Jesus Christ Superstar, then Godspell, and then a show called The Children of Eden, which is by Stephen Schwartz. And I'm missing one, but I'm missing. No, that's everything. That's everything. That's everything. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and next week we'll be talking about Jesus Christ Superstar. These are both works by Andrew Lloyd Webber, Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, or Andrew Lord Lloyd Webber, who is, owns most of the West End in London at this point. He was the first musician in the history of the Western world to make over $1 billion. This is, of course, the guy who also wrote Cats, Phantom of the Opera, and a number of other shows which became tourist sites in New York because they played so long. His first show was Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He wrote it with Tim Rice. Tim Rice wanted to be a rock star. Andrew Lloyd Webber wanted to be the next Richard Rogers. Roy Rogers, yeah, there you go. Richard Rogers. But not writing songs like Richard Rogers did. This is 1968. He's very interested in bringing popular music into the musical theater, and this is just the moment that rock is starting to make an appearance in the musical theater. The first show that is almost entirely rock that plays in New York as a Broadway show, of course, is Hair, which opens on Broadway in 1968. So this is 1968. He meets Tim Rice, and they are commissioned to write a small show to be put on at the Colette School in London, one of the private schools in London. Well, they call them public schools. We would call them private. So they wrote a 15-minute treatment of the story of Joseph in chapters 37 and 38 of Genesis. The figure, of course, who descends from Abraham, of course, who ends up taking the Hebrews into Egypt. There is a very good reason to start with religion. Everybody knows the story. The biggest problem in musical theater is trying to tell the backstory. That is what you need to know for this story to make sense. Because there aren't a lot of efficient ways to tell stories once you're getting into a musical. You have speak, you have a dialogue, and you have song. And if the backstory is too complicated, no one's going to ever understand the story. So writing something like Joseph or Jesus Christ Superstar is a good commercial idea because everybody knows the story to begin with. Now you might have your own take on it, but people know how the story goes. So they wrote a 15-minute version of Joseph. There was a 35-minute version in 1972 at the Edinburgh Festival, and then it finally in 1973 played on the West End in a longer version, and then the final version that's done today was put on in New York for the first time in 1982. When a young guy who wanted to be a musicologist and his wife actually saw that on their honeymoon in New York City in the summer of 1982. It's been a family favorite for a long time. You're about to find out how big of a favorite. It treats the story in a very light way, but it also bears in places the seriousness that it needs. I mean, this is a treatment of the story of Joseph that almost anyone can embrace. The score itself is just a big hodgepodge. What a musicologist would call it is a pastiche, because every style you might want to think of it is there. There's a French cabaret song. There's an Elvis song. There's a Western folk song in it. I mean, all of these musical styles come into it, and usually they put on a cowboy hat or something. When they're doing that, they start dancing like cowboys. So like I said, there's a lot of light moments. But the story of Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat is told in a fairly, the story is really told. It's really placed in front of you. He starts out as his father's 12th son. His father likes him more than anyone else. He gives him this coat, and the other sons get rid of him, and he ends up a slave in Egypt. He interprets dreams for the Pharaoh, becomes a powerful secondary figure to the Pharaoh in Egypt, and he ends up bringing all of the children of Judah or Israel into Egypt at the end of the show. There was a version made it was about 1998 or 9, starring Donny Osmond as Joseph. It was a British version, and the framing device of it is it's taking place at a school, which I think was inspired by the fact that the original version of the show is actually written to be done at a school. So you have kids coming in and out of it. But the first excerpt we're going to see is where it's called The Song of the King. Joseph has been in prison. You might recall he ends up in prison because he's a slave of Potiphar, who is a wealthy, powerful Egyptian, and his wife makes a pass at Joseph, and in the process of that happening, Joseph gets thrown in jail by Potiphar, and as they say in the show, lock him in a cell, throw the key into the Nile as well. Those obvious rhymes that Tim Rice is so famous for. But anyway, but then the Pharaoh's having these dreams that are disturbing, as we all know the story. And Joseph has demonstrated that to a couple of people in the jail that he can interpret their dreams for them. So the Pharaoh hears about him and wants Joseph brought before him to try to interpret these dreams. The original Pharaoh was Tim Rice. Tim Rice wanted to be a rock star, so he turned the Pharaoh into one of the biggest rock stars, just a few years before Elvis Presley. So the Pharaoh is Elvis Presley. And this is the Song of the King.
You tell poor Pharaoh, well, Joseph's crazy, 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 crazy dreaming. Oh, yeah.
So what does Joseph say? Well, the Laird family would like to explain that to you. Like to join me up here? I'll stay that there, I don't care.
Yeah.
7 years of bumper crops are on their
way. Ooh. Years of plenty, endless wheat and tons of hay. Ah. Your farms will boom. Hey,
there won't be room
yay!
To store the surplus food you grow.
After that, the future doesn't look so bright. Egypt's luck will change completely overnight. And famine's hand will stock the land with food at an all-time low. Noble king, there is no doubt what your dream is all about. All these things you saw in your pajamas are a long-range forecast for your farmers. And I'm sure it's crossed your mind what it is you have to find. Find a man who'll lead you through the famine with a flair for economic planning. But who this man could be, I just don't know. Who this man could be, I just don't know.
Who this man should be, I just don't know. Who this man should be, I just don't. Who this man should be, I just don't know. That's a lot of times in the car,
With cassettes and then with compact discs.
those two have the entire show memorized. So as you can see, I mean, the story is told, often with a sense of gentle, that of course is absolutely, inappropriate to telling the story, if you will, but it engages the modern ear in the telling of that story. But you get this one very, very serious moment, and of course, if my life were important, I would ask if I live or die, but I know the answer lies far from this world. I mean, you can't have a much stronger statement of the importance of God in this person's life. Andrew Lloyd Webber, I mean, he's a very interesting composer. I mean, he's written all kinds of things in all sorts of different styles. But more than once, he's gone to the religious fountain, if you will, and used it. And he's also written other shows where there are characters who